and welcome you to the first of the Flow-MER Friday webinar series. This is an initiative that's been started jointly between the Flow-MER team and the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, the Water Office, and it's going to become a regular event where we meet online and have a relatively informal series of presentations where we have each week someone presenting and then opportunity for Q&A. Sorry, this gets a bit laggy at the start, so. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners as First Peoples of the lands and waters of the Murray-Darling Basin. I'd like to recognise their historical and ongoing connection to country and express my respect to their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that there have been past injustices done and commit myself to trying to work with Indigenous people to create a more sustainable future. So Yama, Tēnā koutou from my country where I come from, and I acknowledge all of the people of the basin, and in particular for me, the Ngunnawal people on whose land I speak to you from today. Who am I? For those of you I haven't met before, and there are many familiar names on the lists of attendees, I'm Professor Ross Thompson. I'm Director of the Centre for Applied Water Science and the Institute for Applied Ecology at the University of Canberra. And today I'm speaking to you really as the co-lead of the basin scale component of the Monitoring, Ecology and Research Program. And I lead that with Emily Barbour from CSIRO and previously with Carmel Bellino from CSIRO. Carmel has been elevated within CSIRO to even greater heights, but she is also still involved in this project as one of the project directors. But Emily and myself are the co-leads of this project, and so I'm going to talk a little bit initially about the MER project just to contextualise some of the material you're hearing about today. So the Flow-MER program is a partnership co-led by CSIRO and University of Canberra, but obviously with a really major role from our partners, Charles Sturt University, University of New England, Deakin University, SARDI down in South Australia, New South Wales Government Fisheries, and Arthur Rylah Institute in Victoria. And we work closely on all of these projects, and I want to acknowledge all of their contributions. The Flow-MER program, most of you will know this, but for those that aren't familiar with the program, the Flow-MER program is really divided into two components. There are 7 selected areas across the basin, and those selected areas are shown there. And each of those selected areas has a research team associated with it who are gathering data which is both comparable across the basin and in some cases data which is more specific to their own selected area. And so those 7 selected areas were chosen in order to represent the diversity of habitats across the Murray-Darling Basin and to give us a basin scale insight into the way in which environmental water functions in this landscape. The Basin Scale Integration Program, which is the program that Emily and I lead, is about pulling the data together from the selected areas and other data streams as well to try and generate that basin scale insight. So we operate at that sort of higher level scale, and we pull together both research and evaluation components at that basin scale. The research component, and I'm the lead on the research component of the Basin Scale program, commenced way back, it seems way back now, in March 2019, before we all knew what COVID was. And it largely built on the Environmental Water and Knowledge and Research program, which was a research-focused activity aimed to try and get some fundamental understanding of the ecological processes that might underpin responses to environmental flows. So that has been going for a year or so now, and we're really starting to get some really exciting results already. And one of the drivers behind starting this program webinars now was to allow opportunities to present some of those results as they emerge. The evaluation component, which builds on the LTIM program, the LTIM program just finished recently in June, and the evaluation component of the Flow-MER program has just begun in July. And evaluation component is where we work much more closely with each of the selected areas and really build links to the selected areas and ensure that we are drawing on the data coming out of those selected areas to provide really effective and efficient evaluation. And that's very much a process of conversation between the selected areas and the basin scale program. And so again, it's really timely for us to start the webinar just at the time when we're really building some stronger and more regular contacts with our colleagues in the selected areas. If you do want to know more about the Flow-MER program, the website is up and running, and great credit to Pat Gupta and Shawan Lovett, who are online at the moment, for putting that website together. We were all really proud of it. I think it tells some great stories about environmental water, and you'll see it grow and tell more of our stories as the project goes on. There is also now available online through the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, the Monitoring, Evaluation and Research Program. We've gone through a process of prioritising research projects over the last year. We're now at the point where all of those research projects are at implementation stage. If you want to know more about those, then that is available through the website, where you can see the full Monitoring, Evaluation and Research Program. There's also some more detailed information around each of the projects available both on the website and particularly through these webinars. So why start a webinar? I don't think it's because we all needed another Zoom conference in our life, because most of us have plenty of those going on, but it was really to recognise the opportunity to share knowledge backwards and forwards between a whole lot of different communities who are working on water management. So for the research community, there's the opportunity to draw on the knowledge of local water managers and local engagement officers, but also to share knowledge that's coming out of the research and the evaluation programs on a regular basis. So to try and create a conversation there between researchers and managers. For the selected area researchers, obviously the research program itself doesn't occur in all selected areas, and we don't necessarily have all selected areas having a major role in some of the research projects that have already started. So we felt it was really important to expose our researchers in the selected areas to the research that's happening on at the basin scale, and to get that conversation going and make sure that we take full opportunity of all the expertise that's out there. And then obviously between agencies. Government agencies usually work seamlessly together with an even flow of information at all times. But despite that, we thought that the webinar might provide yet another opportunity to share information between agencies. These sessions are recorded, and they're recorded for a couple of reasons. One, not everyone can be here at all these sessions, and we want to give everyone the opportunity to see the material. But also going forward, we want to use this library of recorded presentations as a way of engaging stakeholders in the research and evaluation program. And as people come in and out of the program at various scales, from selected area all the way up to the top of government, we want to be able to point them to these presentations and be able to get a real oversight of the research that's going on. If you are interested in engaging with the project more, you can obviously contact either myself or Emily Babur at CSIRO. We're, I think, really proud and excited to be associated with the program, and happy to provide a connection into any of the research or evaluation activities that are going on, and provide more information if you want to see it. So that's the introduction from me. I will stop sharing in just a moment and pass over onto Heather McGinness. Now, Heather McGinness is the lead of our diversity theme within MER. She is perhaps best known for her work on waterbirds and migratory waterbirds, where she has been a powerhouse in terms of advancing that knowledge, and has also just been deeply engaged in connecting with communities, different parts of the scientific community, and at the same time doing some research which is just genuinely novel and really exciting. And so I think there's some great stories emerging from Heather's work, and Heather's been a fantastic storyteller for us. And today I'm really looking forward to hearing from her about the very latest things that are coming from the waterbird work. And I'm going to pass over on to Heather right now. So Heather, if you can share your screen. Unmute, Heather.
Okay, thanks everyone for coming today, calling in, I guess, rather than coming. I hope you enjoy this. It's just an introduction to our waterbird movement research. There's a lot more to it than what I'm presenting today, but I'm hoping it will give you some appetite for the new results that we hope to be able to share with you in a year or two. Just to give you a little bit of an overview of the sorts of places that we might be talking about as part of this research. This is Cow Swamp, and it's a breeding colony of straw-necked ibis, white ibis, royal spoonbills, and a couple of other species that was there last season. Even though it was so dry, there was this small breeding colony there at Cow Swamp. And I find these sorts of sites interesting because Cow Swamp is actually a permanent reservoir. And while we know that our waterbird species are dependent on our wetlands and on environmental watering and so on, and especially are missing out on the really big flood events and the really big breeding events, there's still this trickle through of breeding that's occurring. And we really have no idea whether that level of breeding is actually sufficient to maintain our populations. Moving on, as I'm sure you know, any research project like this is a team effort, and I work with some incredibly talented and committed people. This is just some of them. We're constantly trying new things and pushing the boundaries, and I am really grateful for their intelligence, their flexibility, their hard work, and their willingness to have a go. I'm a real have a go type of scientist, and I'm really fortunate to work with people who are able to deal with that, I guess. So, some context. Why are we interested in waterbirds and their habitats and their movements? Well, rates of wetland habitat loss are increasing worldwide as well as in Australia. Waterbird populations have definitely declined, again, worldwide as well as in Australia. And we as Australians have obligations to protect waterbirds and their habitats. And those obligations include international obligations like the Ramsar Convention, the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species, and so on. And then we also have national obligations. There's the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the Water Act, the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and Commonwealth Environmental Water as well. In terms of the MDB plan and Commonwealth Environmental Water, the primary objectives at the moment are increased waterbird abundance and maintenance of waterbird species diversity. They're explicit objectives in the plan, and there are even more explicit targets in there at the moment too. Thing is, if we want to achieve this, there are some issues and some knowledge gaps that we need to address, and these include waterbird movements. They are a highly mobile group. It includes recruitment and mortality rates and drivers, of which we have very little understanding at the moment, and habitat and food requirements and constraints and cues. And if we can start filling some of these knowledge gaps, that will improve our capacity to more effectively target our land and water management actions. And it is land and water management that we need to think about. We will more effectively evaluate our progress, and that relates back to the CEWO evaluation process. And ideally, it should help us to try and predict future outcomes at basin scale as well. So this research project, it's about spatial and temporal scales and drivers of waterbird movements and site use in an attempt to start filling some of those knowledge gaps. Some of the questions that it's asking include when and where do waterbirds move across the Murray-Darling Basin and beyond? Are they moving in response to environmental water or flooding? What does that mean for our perceptions and our predictions of waterbird responses to water management? We're looking at where birds are feeding, where they're roosting, where they're nesting, when and why, and what movement and habitat cues and preferences and limitations we should be taking into account in our water planning for waterbirds, taking into account the whole life cycle. We're also looking at how connected our Australian waterbird populations are spatially and temporally, what the implications of that are for environmental water management, in particular to prevent further population declines, which is the whole idea. The approach we're taking to answer these questions is basically satellite tracking of waterbird movements and habitat use. We take the satellite tracking data and we analyse that together with other spatio-temporal mapping and data sets, other environmental data. And then we take that and we model movements and habitat preferences and the associated wetland and water requirements of waterbirds at different places and times and at different scales. And then we use that information to come up with recommendations for basin scale watering and other management actions. So satellite tracking, what can it tell us? It is a goldmine of information. So it can tell us where, when, how far, how fast birds move. It can tell us how far they're willing to go to forage from their nests and roosts, and that's informative for environmental watering in terms of where to put water for foraging. It can tell us what their site selection parameters are for feeding or sleeping or nesting or shelter or refuge. It tells us about population boundaries and connectivity, cues and triggers for movements or breeding, nesting behaviour, nesting timing, duration. We've got fantastic data sets already for one straw-necked ibis in particular, showing exactly when she was attending the nest versus not, and so on. Differences between species, differences between sexes and age groups, something that we've never really had a good handle on in Australia. And finally, a bit of a lead-in for looking at survival and mortality rates and drivers. The sample sizes are quite small, obviously, when we do satellite tracking, but we've already had some insights coming out of satellite tracking in terms of what happens to these birds and in particular juveniles. The satellite transmitters that we use vary depending on the species, and the technology is constantly improving while the size of the units is shrinking, which we all appreciate, including the birds. So some of the common features are that they're lightweight, they're less than 5% of the body weight of the birds, but usually 1 to 2%. We try to keep it to the absolute minimum. They give really high frequency location fixes, and depending on the transmitter, that might be every few seconds, every minute, every 10 minutes, every hour, every 3 hours. And that comes down to some various features of different transmitters and what we want them to give us. They give us very high accuracy location fixes, and this is something that's really improved in the last 10 years. Satellite transmitters these days can give us proper GPS accuracy of tens of metres and usually less than 15 metres, so we can tell exactly what tree the bird is sleeping in. They give us quite long duration data because they're solar powered. And so usually we get months, sometimes for some birds we get years of data for the same bird. And I'll show you some of that in a minute. And the best thing about them is there's no recapture needed, and you don't need a base station for them to fly past. It's all satellite upload, so it's completely remote. And for the birds that we have in Australia that we study that are mostly nomadic, that's absolutely essential. In terms of capture methods, we have a wide range of capture methods that we use, and they vary again by species, they vary by location, and by what the animals are doing. You know, if the birds are nesting, we might use particular techniques. If they're not, we might use others. So an example for royal spoonbills, we use leg snares, which are a slip noose type of trap. Sometimes we hand capture them if they're young ones who still don't understand that they can fly away from us. And sometimes we use hand nets or a handheld net launcher. We've got a couple of different kinds of handheld net launchers. Australasian bitterns, it's different. We use cage traps with call playback and mirrors to attract males. They're quite vain and they also quite competitive, and I won't say much more about that, but we may also be trying bait this year too. And other species, it could be a range of methods. We also have duck mist nets, we have whoosh net and so on. In terms of licensing and ethics and experience, we have staff that are really well trained and licensed. We are now quite experienced at catching large waders, and also some of our collaborators are experienced in smaller and larger birds as well. We've fitted transmitters to over 80 individuals of a wide range of bird species, not just as part of UCA, but other projects as well. We do all our work with full awareness of the weather. We avoid extremes. We limit our capture usually to early in the day. We minimise disturbance, and we minimise the number of people around. And that's because we've always got to focus on the birds' welfare. It's absolutely about minimising stress on the birds, because we want these birds to live long and healthy lives, and they're doing us a service by teaching us about what they need so that we can better manage our wetlands and our water for the benefit of all of their species. So as Ross mentioned, this is actually building on previous work. We did some satellite tracking of straw-necked ibis, Australian white ibis and royal spoonbills as part of the CEWO waterbird theme. And those results have already been used to inform the NDB plan, environmental watering strategies and state watering plans. There are birds still actively being tracked that were fitted with transmitters as part of the CEWO project. So it's important to not waste those data. And the CEWO research identified a need for additional satellite tracking of species that are dependent on water to feed, not just to breed. So straw-necked ibis obviously are quite happy to forage outside of wetlands. And we really need to get a better handle on what birds that are completely dependent on wetlands for feeding as well as breeding really need and how they move. The other thing that we need to do really is to track movements of birds from other important wetland sites, and I'll explain that context in just a minute. We have a list of priority species, excuse me. Now, these species have been selected for a range of reasons. Ultimately, they need to be informative in terms of environmental watering and environmental water prioritisation. So the top of the list there are the royal spoonbill and Australasian bittern. The other reasons these are chosen are because if we want to get very high accuracy GPS data on their movements, they need to be able to carry a certain weight of transmitter. And so larger birds are better able to do that. While we have these priorities, we're aware that we can't always predict what birds do and where they do it and when. And so we actually have approval for a wide range of other species for satellite tracking if the need arises that we need to track other species as well or as substitutes. So as part of the CEWO project, we deployed 64 transmitters and we kicked off the Flow-MER project with deployment of 11 transmitters last season. They were mostly straw-necked ibis and one royal spoonbill, and we thought that was quite an achievement given the drought and the bushfires and the smoke and the storm conditions and the hail and the general lack of bird breeding as well. And there was a lot of bird breeding abandonment that happened last year too. So we were quite grateful that we got to deploy some transmitters at all last year with multiple disasters, and then COVID hitting us, of course, as well. This year, this season, this spring and summer, we have 30 to 40 transmitters to deploy. The sites and the species that we deploy them on will depend on which species breed, because it's far easier to catch these birds when they're breeding. It'll depend on where they breed, when they breed, and how accessible they are. So for example, if a species is breeding at the top of a red gum, we're unlikely to be able to catch it. Otherwise, we'd have to employ some tree climbing people with the proper qualifications. That might be something we do in the future, but it's not something we'll be doing this year. So there's different parameters around that can sort of limit and control what species we can catch and when. So royal spoonbills, we can catch at any site as long as they're breeding. Same with bitterns. Straw-necked ibis, we have a special new set of 10 transmitters specifically for straw-necked ibis in the Northern Basin this year. Freckled duck, we can catch pretty much any time. They don't need to be breeding. They just need to be in sufficient numbers for us to catch with nets, and so on and so forth for different species. In terms of sites, for the CEWO program, we caught birds across 4 sites and fitted transmitters to those. Those were Barmah Forest, the Crane Lakes, Cow Swamp and Macquarie Marshes. This year, we ideally want to be fitting transmitters to birds at other sites besides those. It's likely we will go back to Barmah Forest, particularly for Australasian bitterns. However, we're open to travelling to any other site in the basin where there are breeding birds of our target species. So it'd be very valuable if those of you listening in who go to these sites and know about the monitoring happening there, if you could let me know if breeding looks like it's starting, because it may be that we could come and satellite track some of the birds in your local area. In terms of outputs, a wide range of outputs are coming from this project. We will be producing some fantastic data sets on movements and habitat selection, and those will be at multiple scales for the selected waterbird species that we track. We'll also be producing a wide range of mapping and visualization products. So we'll be producing maps showing individual and grouped waterbird movements. We'll be showing maps showing foraging and roosting and nesting and traveling sites. Maps that show fixed densities that are like heat maps that represent intense or repeated site use. And that's useful for site prioritisation for environmental watering. And we're also, over the next couple of years, going to be exploring development of new videos or animations or visualisations which highlight key spatiotemporal patterns and processes that we're seeing in the data from our analyses. So this is just an example of a heat map. As I mentioned before, it's essentially just density of fixes for straw-necked ibis over 3 years. And this is when they were travelling. And what this shows really beautifully is that there is a common route going up and down the Murray-Darling Basin that these birds use. It's broad, but it definitely has boundaries, and I can show you some of those in subsequent slides as well. We can look at doing the same thing for when they're roosting, because for straw-necked ibis in particular, we know they roost at night. And so it's very easy to extract the data about roosting. And then we can look at foraging. And you can see there that, you know, foraging habitats are a lot more specific if we're talking about long-term data and resident data. We are putting some effort into developing our new 2D and 3D dynamic movement visualizations. This is being done by Jessica Hodgson, Louise Ord and myself as part of this project in the diversity theme. And just to give you an example, this is a very simple 2D visualization of the movements of elf and adult female straw-necked ibis over a period of about 3 years. It's interesting to us to see this just because it demonstrates things like how quickly they will move up and down the basin. What we would like to do to improve on this is to actually include some dynamic layers to do with water and inundation and what's going on in terms of surface water over time as birds move around, and also other environmental layers like NDVI, for example, to represent productivity. Doing this at different scales and so on. So at the top and the bottom of this movement image, elf is spending a lot of time foraging and roosting and so on. She's got an overwintering site up in Queensland, and then she comes back to Victoria to forage. She has not yet bred again in the 3 years that we've been tracking her, and that's interesting in itself. And then just this year, she did a massive detour. We thought she was a classic migratory type bird, but she quite happily took a detour over to the flooding at the Thomson River in 2020. And we'd like to be able to show that, you know, in these 2D visualizations. We are also working on developing some custom 3D visualizations of bird movements, and this is for birds for which we have altitude data. Now, not all of our trackers record altitude data, and that's because of limitations in transmitting data through the satellites. But last season, we deployed a new type of transmitter on a straw-necked ibis named Han Solo. And this transmitter collects very high frequency fixed data, as well as altitude and speed and a range of environmental factors. In February this year, Han Solo flew up to Newcastle area quite quickly. He then spent about 5 months there, and just last week he flew back south, and he is now foraging around Mathaura and sleeping in Barmamillowa Forest. And I will, if you don't mind, just show you the latest data over the last couple of days. So this is Mathaura, Barmamillowa Forest is over here, and these are some of the movements of Han Solo over just, you know, quite a short period. Going back to this, I want to show you, this is a very rough approximation of the sorts of things we may be able to do in terms of 3D visualization. Now, this uses data from our satellite tracking, and it's uploaded it to a program that is used by hang gliders to track their flights. Now, what we want to do is create a version of this that is customizable for our own purposes with specific attributes that are useful in terms of interpreting habitat use and decisions being made by these birds. And one of the advantages of looking at 3D data like this is you literally have a bird's eye view of what that bird is seeing. And that can help to understand the decisions they're making about their habitat use. And so again, what we would like to do, here he goes flying up high, what we would like to do is produce a 3D animation like this that shows water and shows surface water changing to match the time and the exact period. There he is foraging, for which the bird is flying. And you can do all sorts of things with these sorts of animations. The data here are mostly incorrect, especially date. But altitude is correct here. We want to have all correct data and a variety of other different layers that help us to interpret exactly what's going on in terms of habitat choice for these birds. Some of the cool things you can do with these is you can actually zoom out and see what their trail was. And then you can choose a particular spot on that trail. So I might want to backtrack to when he's approaching Dubbo, or perhaps, is this Lake Cowell, I think? And then we can zoom in and see what that bird does as it's approaching that habitat. I would like to have labels for every wetland and every river and every town and that sort of thing. But this is pretty exciting. And even while this is a rough draft of the sorts of things we might be able to produce, I think that the future is looking good for this sort of thing, helping us to better communicate what we're seeing as well as understand it as well. Okay, so let's go back. What other sorts of outputs will we be coming up with? All those images are very pretty, but we actually need to do some real science as well. We'll be looking at doing movement statistics and calculations, including looking at foraging and nomadic or migration distances, home ranges, breeding movements, those sorts of things. And the reason we need these is because they tell us where and when and for how long environmental water should be allocated to support foraging habitat and food resources. We also will be doing habitat selection models, and they will tell us what and where the key habitats are that are used. And again, where, when and for how long environmental water could be allocated to support those key habitats. And we can also use models to look at relationships between various things like bird species, capture site, biomass, a range of other different pieces of data that we collect, and the relationships between those things and environmental water, flooding, season, space use, and those sorts of things. And those tell us what factors might affect waterbird responses to environmental water. And that's something that's important when you, for example, have an unexpected response or a lack of response. Just as an example of some of the sorts of habitat selection modelling that we can do, this is a model that was done, an analysis that was done for straw-necked ibis that were tracked between 2016 and 2020. And this is just one variable. So this is a variable called the multi-resolution valley bottom flatness index. And essentially it's just an index that shows erosional or steep habitats versus depositional or flat habitats in terms of going from 0 to 9. And there's a very clear association in terms of habitat selection for straw-necked ibis going for depositional and flat habitats. And we can do this for a wide range of other environmental variables, either separately or together. This is an example of water observations from space and its frequency of wetting of any site where the birds were. And for straw-necked ibis, it's a relatively complex relationship because, as I said before, they're quite happy to forage in drier or damp environments. Now, we would expect a very different looking graph here for royal spoonbills and for Australasian bitterns. But those sorts of analyses help us to predict where birds might be and how they might respond. We are quite active in terms of communications and engagement. Freya Robinson, Jessica Hodgson and myself do most of this. We have a dedicated detailed website for the waterbird research, and we regularly update our satellite tracking maps and other pieces of information on that website. We also run 3 different social media sites, and we have a subscription list for email updates about where the birds are and what they're doing. So if you want to be added to that subscription list, then drop me a line and I can add you to that. It's much more frequent emails over the spring and summer when birds are moving, and very quiet during winter when they're not really moving very much. But it can be interesting. I usually try and share a few maps, custom maps at a sort of more local scales as part of those emails. And then there's a wide range of other pieces of communications that we try to share. So coming back to why we're doing this, waterbird ecology is truly basin scale. It integrates local, regional and basin responses and management and policy. And by getting better understanding of the scales and the drivers of waterbird movements and their site use, that should help us to explain how site scale waterbird responses to environmental water are linked to basin and national scale responses and drivers, and that's incredibly important. And also how environmental water affects the presence and the distribution and the abundance of waterbirds. And that's one of the questions specific to the Commonwealth Environmental Water Officers program. This will ultimately facilitate, we hope, better basin scale planning of environmental water, better prediction of expected outcomes for waterbirds, and better evaluation and explanation of unexpected outcomes as well. And finally, just to finish off, if the aim of our management and our policies is to increase waterbird populations and maintain species diversity, just a reminder that we actually need to think about supporting the whole life cycle of these species. Our knowledge is pretty good when it comes to eggs and chicks and getting birds to breed. But when it comes to juveniles and subadults and adults, and in particular movements and survival and mortality, our knowledge is much more poor, even for some of our big, common, obvious birds. And so I think I'll just leave you with that we need to think about whole life cycles if we want to maintain populations. Thanks for your time and for listening, and I'm very happy to take any questions and comments.